All right, we're off and running. Happy New Year to everyone. I hope you all enjoyed our week off last Wednesday, and no one was too upset that we didn't get to discuss the Torah portion. But hopefully you did read the Torah portion for yourself last week. So last week's Torah portion was Shemot, and this week's Torah portion is Vaera, which means we're now living in the land of. We're not in the desert yet, not this week. Egypt. We're still in Egypt. We're still down in Mitzrayim. And we're going to leave Egypt, right? We're just going to pack our bags and leave one day, yes? Very simple process to get out of Egypt? No? Not so much? Well, how do we get out of Egypt? What's the main power behind our exit? God. God leads us out of Egypt. God takes us out of Egypt. Why? I mean, did we deserve it?
No.
Did we earn it? No, everybody's very quick on that. No. Maybe? Yes? No? Does God ever say why He's taking us out?
Because He heard our cries, and there was also the covenant.
So He heard our cries. So there's a certain element of, we're just going to use the shorthand word of mercy, that God hears our suffering and takes us out. On top of that, there is an element of justice vis-a-vis the covenant. God had made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that promise was now due. And so, in order to be fair, God had to fulfill it, right? But was there any justice for our own merit? That is to say, if there hadn't been a covenant, and if God wasn't necessarily feeling merciful at the time, would we have deserved for God to take us out of Egypt because we had done something worthy of earning that act of power on our behalf? At the moment, that's a rhetorical question. We're going to go ahead and take a look and see whether or not we were in the right situation, the right frame of mind for all of this to take place. And we're going to start right at the beginning of Vaera this week. So we are at page 351 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, which is chapter 6 of the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, but verse 2. All right, verse 2. So Moses has already come, and he has made his appeal to the people. And what was the initial response from the people when he showed up? What happened? He showed up, he said, let's go, and Pharaoh did what? Made them without straw. Made things even worse for the people, and the people were like, well, gee, thanks a lot, Mr. Moses. Wonderful liberator, work is harder now. And so we begin Vaera with God's response and Moses' continued musings about what he's doing. All right, so who'd like to lead us off on the good old English side? Don't all volunteer at once. I know we're all afraid of English.
God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name.
Which we usually pronounce?
We usually pronounce Adonai.
Adonai, right? The Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. The Tetragrammaton, if you want to use the fancy word for it. The four-letter name of God. Okay? We'll come back to that, don't worry. But as he's trying to comfort Moses from this seeming initial failure, he's saying, I'm God. And by the way, whenever you see the word Lord like that in small capital letters in the Chumash, that means that in the Hebrew it's referring to the Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey name. This is, don't worry, I am Adonai. I came to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. I didn't use the name Adonai. We're going to, like I said, come back to that question. But I did make a covenant with them. So keep reading.
I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements. And I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God, who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians.
Man, a little redundant here, God. It's like, sorry, what's your name again? I mean, I am God. I will be your God. You will be my people, and I will be your God, because God is going to save you as long as God is with you. God, Lord, Lord. All right, we're going to come back to why this is so repetitive, but first we continue the speech.
I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession, I the Lord. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moses, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage.
All right, so God gives Moses this second speech, and he goes back to them and says, never fear, things may be worse since I showed up, but let me explain. The Lord is going to take you out and do what he promised to do for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And everyone said, and they pretty much ignore him and get back to all the extra work that he has earned for them. All right. So God's going to give him a second pep talk. Keep going.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, go and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites depart from his land. But Moses appeared to the Lord, saying... Appealed, to the Lord, saying, the Israelites would not listen to me. How then should Pharaoh heed me, a man of impeded speech? So the Lord spoke to both Moses and Aaron in regard to the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, instructing them to deliver the Israelites from the land of Egypt.
Okay. Is that rain?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow.
Oh my gosh, it is.
That's going to slow down the painting. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just noticed the computer's going to try and restart itself. Again. Go to sleep. Don't do that. Okay. So it goes to the Israelites. The Israelites, now having been turned even more bitter, basically ignore Moses' second proclamation from God. And then God says, don't worry about it. Go to Pharaoh. And Moses says, what? You want me to go to Pharaoh when they won't listen to me? And God says, yeah, I do. And you will. All right. A lot. Actually, why don't we go ahead and get that door shut before we flood out of the room?
Now, to be fair,
Yeah.
Moses was raised in the palace. He's not exactly a man of the people. So, whereas Pharaoh already knows him because Moses was raised in the palace. So there might be more reason, not a lot, because parents don't generally listen to their kids, but there might be more reason to think that Moses might relate better in the palace than he would.
That he might play better to that audience.
Play better to that audience. I can just see them muttering, there goes Dr. Sugar again, telling him God's talking to him.
Yeah, here he comes slumming again.
Yeah.
But Moses is the one who thinks going to the palace will be more difficult.
Yes.
It's not God that thinks, it's not that Moses thinks, oh, well, phew, at least in the palace I know people. It's Moses that says going to the palace is going to be even harder than going here.
Yeah, because he knows the people there already too.
and he knows, and he also knows the reason why they might say no. So we're going to come back to that, but I want to come back just to start, and we'll finish on this note as well, but we're going to start with here. What does it mean that God didn't make myself known to them by the name Adonai. Remember back in our very beginning of this parasha, it says, I appeared to the other patriarchs as El Shaddai, but I didn't make known to them my name Adonai, the Yud He Vav He. At least that is one way of translating it. What does that mean? And why would that be significant? And is it true? Have we seen the name Adonai since the beginning of Genesis to here? Yeah, all over the place. The name appears continually throughout the stories of God's interactions with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, what does that mean? Well, let's start, as we often do, with the explanation that Rashi gives it. Handout's coming round.
I went back to Lesson Chabidini by Vaera Adonai and Abraham.
Yep.
As Adonai spoke to Abraham, you're right. That's right.
The name Adonai appears quite a lot. Now, there is a contention of whether or not the narrator uses the term Adonai, but not necessarily the dialogue using the term Adonai. But that's not the solution that Rashi uses. Rashi uses a different explanation. If someone here have at least the ability to pronounce the Hebrew from Rashi's commentary, would like to read it for us? Anyone volunteering? No one? Everyone's a little hesitant?
You mean what's on the top?
Yeah, on the top there. You're looking...
It's not written here. Lo hodahti. Why is there a final comma in the middle of the word?
That's a good question. It must have, this is the typo, sorry. It should be because the actual phrase should be lo hodati. There shouldn't be that chaf there at all. That's what happens when you're cutting and pasting in non-Hebrew word processors. Things creep in. The chaf should not be there, correct. Neither the chaf nor a chaf sofit.
So it should just say
Lo hodati, right.
And on the next line, lo nodati.
Exactly. And lo nodati is exactly what it says in the text. So it doesn't say lo hodati, which would be translated as, but my name, meaning the Yud He Vav He, I did not make known to them. But instead, the verse we have here from the book of Exodus says lo no nodati.
It's only changing the first letter.
Correct. Which would be, I did not become known. And Rashi's going to explain for us what this means, at least in his interpretation of that grammatical shift, which would be, I was not recognized by them with keeping my attribute of faith, by dint of which my name is called Yud He Vav He, which means I am faithful to fulfill my words. For I made promises to them, meaning the patriarchs, but I did not fulfill them while they were still alive. All right, so you have to trust Rashi on the grammar here, that this is one way to interpret it. That, yes, the name Adonai was not unknown through the patriarchal time, but the name of Adonai implies a faithful fulfillment of the promises that have been made. And the ultimate faithful fulfillment of the promise that was made of the redemption of the people and the establishment of them in the land of Canaan had not been fulfilled during the time of the patriarchs. They were living there, but they hadn't taken proper permanent possession of the land. Therefore, he wasn't fully realized as Adonai by the patriarchs. That makes sense? They were too early. So it wasn't that the name itself was unknown. The full manifestation of the faithful fulfillment of promises, which is implied by that name, was still unrealized during the time of the patriarchs. How are we doing on this?
But his name is I will be who I will be. Is that, I mean, that's a pretty broad thing. How does that come to mean specifically this promise?
That's a very good question, and we're gonna unravel that in a little while. Of what exactly does this name mean that implies to Rashi at least, and the traditional midrash, that the fulfillment of promises is somehow embedded within this name, as opposed to any of the other names of God. And we're gonna wrestle with that. But that's the question that comes out of this, which is, well, why can't Elohim, why can't El Shaddai also convey the notion of God's faithful fulfillment of promises? And we're going to have to wrestle with that. But there's another way to handle this question of what did the patriarchs know and what didn't they know, compared to what Moses is now bringing as a revelation to the people. And that's taken from the Targum Yonatan. The Targum Yonatan is the Aramaic translation of the Torah that is considered to be authoritative. That make sense? All right, not every translation, sorry JPS and sorry Alder and Everett Fox and all those other good translations out there of the Torah, they're not considered to be authoritative by Jewish tradition. They're considered to be approximations of people's attempts to try and render the Torah in another language. The Aramaic translation that's in the Targum Yonatan is respected by tradition as being authoritative. This is the Word of God in Aramaic, which is one of those sister languages of Hebrew. Make sense? So therefore, when the Targum Yonatan translates something in a way that seems significantly different than what we might translate the Hebrew as, we have to sit up and take notice. Because it is, by tradition, it's taken as meaning this is the way you should understand those Hebrew words, even though they might imply on the surface a different meaning. How are we following on that? All right, so should we see what Targum Yonatan does with this? All right, who wants to read a little Aramaic and English? So we're going through 3 levels of translation here. It's the Hebrew to the Aramaic to English. But I'm assuming that most people here wouldn't have benefited from the Aramaic. Or maybe I'll bring that next time. You volunteering? I appeared.
The second paragraph?
Yep.
Okay. And I appeared unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, as God Almighty.
Which is the English for El Shaddai.
And by my name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh.
What?
What? And by my name. And.
Yes. And. So what we see here is the sense that we get from the JPS translation, the Jewish Publication Society translation, which is what Eitz Chaim Chumash uses, is it said, but I did not make myself known. And the reason they do that, of course, is because if you look in the Hebrew on page 351, this is verse 3, after the phrase El Shaddai, or under, I should say, the Shaddai, you get a lovely little Hebrew trope symbol. That little Hebrew trope symbol, the wishbone, exactly, also known as a etnachta, exactly, and the etnachta is the major mid-pause of a sentence. It's they're similar to like a semicolon, often in the sentence. That means for most translators that what comes before it is one sentence, one clause, and what comes after it is a second clause. So they read it as saying, I appeared to them as El Shaddai. Take a big breath, moving on to a second clause, and my name Adonai, which is, if we're reading this literally, Ushmi Adonai, and my name Adonai, Lo nodati lahem, I did not make known to them. That's the reason why JPS translates it this way. What Targum Yonatan does that's so different is he says, forget the trope symbol. I want you to take a breath after the phrase, after the word Adonai. I appeared to them as El Shaddai and by my name Adonai, but I didn't make myself known to them. And now we have to read what Targum Yonatan means by I didn't make myself known to them. You want to continue to read there, Harriet? However,
my essential presence, I did not make known to them.
All right. So yeah, they knew El Shaddai and they knew the name Adonai, but they didn't know my true Shekhinah, my true presence for them. So he's just basically parsing the sentence in a different spot. And by doing so, making a fundamental different statement than the way that JPS translates it and the way that most other translators do, who follow the trope symbols for getting an idea of where the sentence should pause.
When did the trope symbols appear?
The trope symbols appeared in the forms that we have now about about between 15 and 1300 years ago.
Really?
Yeah,
That long?
that long ago. When the Masoretes were codifying the precise structure of the words and the sentences, the verses and the breakdown, was when they began to appear. And Targum Yonatan most likely predates that period. He would have been before the official codification of the trope.
So he didn't see the tropes.
Well, he would have had his own tradition of how to properly read the sentences, which is why his sentences finish in the same place that our sentences finish. But whether he had the tradition of where the pause went, but ignored it for this particular interpretation, or not, unfortunately, we don't have his diary to tell us. But it does change the feeling of it significantly, yes? Or does it?
Well, I was just gonna say, there is another pause in the tropes after Adonai, because Ushmi Adonai
Mhm.
is one phrase,
Correct.
and then the rest of it is a second trope phrase.
Absolutely. The phrase Ushmi Adonai can be separated from Velo Nadati Lahem. I mean, that can be separated from that phrase. So it's not unreasonable to pause after that phrase and then begin a new one. It's just not the way anyone else seems to be writing the grammar, the punctuation. But he did. But is it so different? Is it such a big difference between that and saying they didn't know the name Adonai? I mean, on the one hand, it's a big difference because it makes it much easier for us to simply say, oh, well, of course, all those instances of the name Adonai appearing in the first book of the Torah, no problem, doesn't contradict this at all. But on the other hand, he is still capturing perhaps the same notion, that there was an aspect of God that was not revealed to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is being revealed now to the people of Egypt, the people in Egypt. And in that, they basically are saying the same thing. Different aspects, perhaps? Because what's the aspect of God that's being revealed, according to Rashi, that wasn't revealed to the patriarchs?
Faithfulness to fulfill his words.
The faithfulness.
Faithfulness. So far we had mercy up there, now we got faithful.
This faithful fulfillment. And what is Targum Yonatan saying is being revealed now?
My essential presence.
The essential presence, which we're just going to abbreviate to presence. Well, those are not necessarily mutually contradictory. I mean, you can say that God's essential presence can be revealed through faithfulness more than through other aspects of godly action and interaction with humanity. Maybe?
Why faithful as opposed to merciful or just? I mean, those are all attributes of his presence.
Why faithful as opposed to merciful or just? And indeed, what we're going to have to wrestle with then is, what would it be about this particular moment in time that would generate a different action by God, a different manifestation of God's will and interaction with humanity that previously wasn't either present or more perhaps clear, wasn't needed to be at the forefront of his interactions with the people. So let's take a look at a possible explanation taken from Vayikra Rabbah, from the great Midrash. Who'd like to read the paragraph beginning Rav Huna? You going to keep going? Thanks.
Now Huna said in the name of God Kaparah, because of four things Israel was redeemed from Egypt. They didn't change their names or their language. They didn't speak Lashon Hara, and none of them was promiscuous.
Okay. Is that to our credit, or is that an insult? Remember, we began the question of why did we get taken out of Egypt? This is one particular answer, one explanation. Not the only one, but one of them. The reason we got taken out, the reason why we were worthy to be redeemed was because of these four things. Not changing language, not changing names, not doing Lashon Hara, and not fooling around. Is that laudatory of the Israelites? Or is that derogatory of them? I mean, if you are looking back on your ancestors and say, well, they merited to leave because of they did these four things. Or are we saying the only four things they did were these? But just those were enough. It'd be like saying, look, everything else you could imagine that was bad, they were doing. But these four things they protected and didn't change and didn't do. And just on the merit of these four things, they were worthy of being redeemed. But trust me, for the rest of their behavior, there was nothing worth redemption in all the rest of their behavior. Theft, murder, idolatry, everything else they were doing. But these four things they did right, and that was enough.
But they don't, it doesn't say that.
Well,
Are we reading into it something that it doesn't say?
what would be more worthy of redemption? Not changing the names that you were using to name your children, or not stealing from other people? Which one's a mitzvah?
No, not stealing.
Right. So which one is normally considered more meritorious?
Not stealing.
Is that listed?
No.
Therefore, they were. If we're talking about the things that added to their merit, that gave them the merit that was enough to move them out of Egypt, you would list all the things that gave them merit. According to Midrash, the only four things they had going for them were these, which by implication, as kind of a backhanded insult, or front-handed insult, it's backhanded compliment or front-handed, by implication, if you read it the other direction, the corollary, the opposite restatement of it is the only four righteous things they were still doing were this, and everything else that could be bad, they were doing.
Well, two things. One, I've heard we reached the 49th level, and had God not taken us out, we've been totally destroyed at the 50th level. The other thing is, I think they did speak Lashon Hara, because when the brothers came to Joseph after Jacob died, and they basically lied, so that father said, you're supposed to forgive us, which there's no indication he ever did that.
Well, there is a slight difference between Lashon Hara and Sheker, between Lashon Hara and outright lies, but more to the point, the generation of Joseph and the brothers was not considered to be part of this time period. It's more the generation that was leaving only had these four things going for them. And only two of which, of course, are actually mitzvahs.
This is a little frightening because I was wait a minute. Our ancestors spoke Yiddish and we've abandoned our language. Does that mean we're in trouble?
Well, what about the people who abandoned language to start speaking Yiddish?
Yes, they did abandon, yes. Well, they did abandon Hebrew for that. But if a holy language, maybe they had a good reason for it. But if you abandon the language, either that or this is not such a concept deal to abandon the language. You're right, it's not that big a deal.
Well, it certainly isn't a mitzvah, although if we lost touch completely with Hebrew, then we would lose touch with Revelation. And then that follows, that brings in its wake many other negative side effects, obviously. If we can't understand Torah anymore, how can we possibly fulfill it? But the question here was more of how much had they integrated into Egyptian society? How much had they disappeared? How much had they assimilated, to use the modern word, into Egyptian society? And this particular midrash is saying, pretty much mostly. The only thing that was really left was these four things. And it's because of that we can understand why Moses was very worried about going to Pharaoh and why perhaps his worry was unfounded. Okay, so we have this little line here from Rashi. This is one of 10 Kal V'chomers in the Torah. A Kal V'chomer, has anyone done any midrashic study where they come across this term?
I've heard it, I can't remember.
You've heard of it? Michael, you want to try and give a quick explanation?
Even the more so.
Even the more so. So for example, if If I'm not going to play fetch with my dog on a bright sunny day, when it's raining, all the more so I'm not going outside to play fetch. Right? It's called arguing from a minor to a major. If something is true for a lighter thing, a smaller, less significant, or less likely condition, in the larger, more likely, more extreme condition, all the more so it would still hold true. Does that make sense? Right? If you would give up your seat for your wife on the bus, all the more so you'd give up your seat for your wife on the Titanic, on the lifeboat. Right? If you give it up when it doesn't really matter, when it really matters, of course you would. We can argue about whether or not people really are that behavior when it's life and death, but that's the basic structure. And so this question then says, when Moses says to God, you want me to go to Pharaoh, but they wouldn't listen to me. If they wouldn't listen to me when I'm bringing them a promise of redemption, which is for their own good, all the more so Pharaoh's not going to listen to me when I'm bringing him a threat that things are going to go bad and he should give up the bounty that he has by having the Israelites working for him. So this is one of 10 times within the Torah that there is a Kal v'chomer argument. And by Torah they actually mean the entire Tanakh. This is one of the 10 times. The full list is in the Midrash, where a person within the text actually makes such an argument. And that style of argument becomes very, very important in later rabbinic thinking for deciding and interpreting Jewish law, for halakha. But on the surface it might seem that the main reason that Moses is upset and thinks that this isn't going to work is because the promise for one was redemption, but the promise for the other is for loss. Right? If the people who have something to gain won't listen, then the people who have something to lose won't listen. But there's another way to interpret it, which is if the Israelites, who have become a pale imitation of the Egyptians, won't listen, then the Egyptians, who are the real Egyptians, all the more so they're not going to listen. Make sense? How do we know that the Israelites had become like the Egyptians? Even more than that Midrash, which, as Miriam pointed out, is kind of only convincing if you read it backwards, as a negative criticism rather than as a positive of they kept these 4 things. And the best example we have is from the work of Ezekiel, from Yechezkel, the prophet. Miriam, would you like to read
Yes.
a little prophetic wisdom for us at the bottom there?
On that day I swore to them that I would bring them out of Egypt into a land I had searched out for them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most beautiful of all lands.
So this is Ezekiel retelling the story of the Exodus.
And I said to them, each of you, get rid of the vile images you have set your eyes on, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But they rebelled against me and would not listen to me. They did not get rid of the vile images that they had set their eyes on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt.
All right, so how had they become Egyptian in the eyes of Ezekiel?
They didn't forsake the idols.
They had idols. Did Abraham have idols? Did Abraham have idols? Please, this should be an easy answer. No, absolutely not. We know from the Midrash at least that he destroyed idols. Did Isaac have idols? No. Did Jacob have idols? No. Where do these idols come from? From living among the Egyptians and adopting their ways. So the Israelites had become idolaters while they were living in Egypt, according to Ezekiel. And when God told them, get rid of your idols so I can lead you out, I said, no, I like my idols. Keep going.
So I said, I would pour out my wrath on them and spend my anger against them in Egypt. But for the sake of my name, I did what would keep it from being profaned in the eyes of the nations they lived among. And in whose sight I had revealed myself to the Israelites by bringing them out of Egypt. Therefore, I led them out of Egypt and brought them into the desert. I gave them my decrees and made known to them my laws. For the man who obeys them will live by them.
So, why did God take us out of Egypt? For the sake of his, so he wouldn't be seen as being unable to fulfill that promise he had made to our ancestors, so he wouldn't be seen as being an impotent deity. Even though they weren't deserving of it, because they were holding on to their idols even after they'd been told not to, God was still willing to take them out.
And there's a lot of that carries on through the plagues. The whole idea of that he hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he could make a name for himself, basically. And I never did get that. Midrash, which is
Absolutely, and that's a whole nother class. the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and the making a name for myself on this day motif is a very important theme of the Exodus, and one beyond the scope of today's discussion, because it requires at least one whole session or more, or a lifetime to understand. But a very good connection. But the topic for today, God seems to be taking us out even though we don't deserve it. The Midrash posited 4 rather minor things that were at least on the credit side of our sheet, and said, well, at least for those, God was willing to take us out. But generally, this is not a very laudatory view of the Israelites living in the land of Egypt. Correct? All right, let's drive it home with just another couple quotes. You want to keep going?
After Israel endured a long time in Egypt, they returned to idolatry like the Egyptians.
After all, we know that before Abraham, his family was idolatrous. So after they'd been in Egypt for a while, they reverted to their old ways.
Except for the tribe of Levi, who continued the instructions of their ancestors and never practiced idolatry.
Yay, Levites.
Almost everything planted by Abraham was uprooted, and the sons of Jacob returned to the errors of the world, and out of love for us,
Sorry, that's my
and to keep the
typo.
oath to Abraham, did Adonai send Moses our teacher.
So why did God help us?
Out of love.
Love and fulfillment of the promise, the covenant. Not because we were so gung-ho righteous, because we weren't. Whoops. And one more.
The benefit of the command for the Pesach sacrifice was to draw the Israelites away from the deficient beliefs of the Egyptians. For the Egyptians thought it abominable to sacrifice sheep and eat them, since they thought that their god was the constellation Aries.
Okay, so Relbog, also known as Gasanides, great rabbi and astronomer from the Middle Ages, around the 1300s. He actually laid the foundation, doesn't get the for taking the system and having it be Copernicus. Before, I might point out. He noted errors, Earth-centered universe model, stars hundreds of light years away. He actually was the only medieval astronomer to get the right calculation distant they really were from us. Unfortunately, he didn't have the skill in his lifetime, the mathematics, to work out the proper to understand it was the sun at the center, the earth going, that the Ptolemaic math work. The Enlightenment, also a great rabbi. Sacrifice. That is a sacrifice that we make, what we take our Pesach from sign from to God that yes, to the idolaters would be considered. Does it make sense? Smashing an idol. Make sense? So there is a rather consistent theme throughout many that people needed to become assimilated, and that they needed to have that assimilation, specifically the idolatrous assimilation, broken before they could be free of Egypt and truly move towards God. Which brings us back to our question of why God's name, Yud He Vav He, now becomes of central importance. There's two common and easy to grasp. The one at the bottom of the page, which is taken from Sefer, which is one of the earliest collections of Mash. It says, notice how sometimes Yud Hey Vav in the Torah, and sometimes, well, there's a reason for that. Everywhere Yud Hey and Vav Hey shows up, it is written divine mercy. As it is said, Vav Hey, God, which is the phrase Adonai, where that name is written, it refers to Exodus 2:8. Onto the judge, Elohim, will come the complaint of these two. And as a curse, a judge. The word there is Elohim. So the word El or El Shaddai, and if that was the aspect that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were most familiar with, then they didn't need to see God's mercy so much. After all, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were, generally speaking, pretty good at doing the right thing. And so it wasn't unusual for them to expect that God would reward them for having done the right thing. Now imagine you are an Israelite slave coming face to face with your idolatry and your transgressions, and the God conception that you know of your ancestors is one of a God who is a God of justice. You think you're getting out of jail anytime soon? No, if you know that the warden is a hard-nosed judge, then you know you're going to stay here forever until you get it right. However, if it's revealed to you that yes, God is a God of justice, but God is also Yud He Vav He, a God of mercy, now you have some hope. And it took the Israelites a while to learn that. As Ralbach points out, it took them at least until the Pesach sacrifice to distance themselves enough from the Egyptian gods to recognize that their God actually would allow them to come out of God's mercy rather than God's justice for their righteousness, so to speak. Does that make sense?
But it also says that His mercy, Yud Hey Vav Hey, is the essential presence.
Exactly.
So that is the most influential aspect of God.
The most influential, as we see day in, day out from God's mercy. And as we know from the phrase Yud He Vav He as being an exclusive name for God. The word Elohim is used, as we see here, for human judges in some cases. The word Elohim can be used for pagan deities, much as the word God in English can be used for both capital G God and lowercase g gods. The word Elohim is used for divinities all around. But Yud He Vav He only refers to Adonai, only refers to our God. And as Michael was pointing out, it's no coincidence that that particular name is understood by our tradition as referring to the aspect of God's mercy. Make sense? I said there were two explanations for why this Yud He Vav He would become more important to our ancestors at this stage in their time. That was number two. The number one explanation, the one right above it, is what does Yud He Vav He actually mean? And it refers back to, as was mentioned at the very beginning of class, the discussion at the end of last week's Torah portion between God and Moses at the burning bush, where Moses says, "And who do I say is coming?" And God responds with, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh," which is Adonai. That is to say, the word Adonai is somehow considered to be a compound form or equivalency to the longer sentence, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, which means, as I have here in the bold underlined English, either I am that I am, or I will be that I will be. Now this is the source of great discussion and commentary and exposition throughout Jewish history, but there is one line of reasoning that I would like to advance that I think would make a lot of sense for our ancestors to hear at this particular time, which is the idea that this is one of the proof texts for the understanding of God through reason rather than revelation. That is to say, you can experience God through moments of revelation. You can experience or find God through a flash, as it were. Or you can try and find God by figuring out that God logically makes sense. And this was a very common pastime during the Middle Ages. It's not exactly as popular anymore nowadays because most people don't sit around doing philosophy nowadays. But the logic goes much like we have here in steps 1, 2, and 3. Something that exists could not have made itself. Right? I exist, I did not make myself. This table exists, the table did not make itself. Something had to make the table. Let's call it a man. Well, something had to make the man. Let's call it mother and father. Well, something had to make the mother and father. All the way back, and let's say we get into evolution and we say they're back into pond scum, and then they're back into single cell organisms, and that's some amino chain, all the way back into the dusts of stars. Something ultimately tells us, number 2, an infinite regress is impossible. It doesn't make sense to say it was going back forever and ever and ever, because something that exists cannot trace its cause backwards in time infinitely, because it would then have no start. After all, if it's infinite, there is no beginning. And therefore, if there is no start, there would be no current existence. You're beginning to see why philosophy is not such a popular pastime nowadays? Okay. Just stick with me for a couple more minutes, all right? Therefore, number 3, there must have been a first cause to begin the chain of creation. This is how you figure out that there's a God without a Torah. Is you sit down, much like Abraham is said to have done, and say, well, where did all of this come from? Because everything comes from something. And eventually you realize, well, if everything comes from something, and the everything chain of something can't go on forever, because then it doesn't have a beginning, and if it doesn't have a beginning, it can't have a middle, then there must have been something at that beginning. And that thing at the beginning must be something that exists without having to be made. It is because its nature is to be. It is that it is. Or, said in the first person, I am that I am. Unlike everything else in reality, where I would say I am because my parents were, God says I am because I am. And that difference between God and the rest of creation is encapsulated in this notion of Adonai, in this name of God, which for our ancestors living in Egypt, who had become assimilated into an idolatrous set of beliefs and practice, who had lost the teachings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and become distanced from God as God, bringing to them a proof that they could understand and think about before the miracles began would have been essential. Look, you're sitting here in the pits of slavery and you're clutching your idol. Let me explain to you why there is something greater than this. Where'd the idol come from? Where'd the wood come from? Where'd that come from? Where'd all that come? All the way back. Okay, well, there had to be a beginning, right? Well, that beginning is calling you. And that beginning is bigger than any idol. That beginning is bigger than any pharaoh. And that beginning is on your side. And that beginning gave you a promise. And we're going to call that beginning Adonai. And from now on, you're going to see things are going to get better. Make sense? I think it made sense to them too. Any questions? Well, lots of them, I'm sure, but any we can answer in the confines of this course.
Why the controversy between the present tense and the future tense?
Well, the problem is that the way Hebrew grammar works, the future tense can often be used either as a past sense or as a present sense. The notion of tense in the strictest sense of the word is not exactly equivalent to the way English breaks up tenses in biblical Hebrew. And so it's a little bit hard to say incontrovertibly it's definitely talking about the future or definitely talking about the past or definitely talking about the present, which is why there are volumes in the library that take up how best to understand this phrase. But one way that it hasn't been understood, and one way that I think would have mattered a lot to our ancestors at this point in their time, at this point in their lack of faith and understanding of God, is to take it as this first cause philosophical proof for God that could reach out to them despite their essential atheism. You know, the problem with idolatry is that idolatry isn't really another form of theism. It's in fact denying the ultimate truth of the ultimate God, which is in its own way a form of atheism. And this is essentially shattering that myth, that it's not about just worshiping super powerful things up in the sky, it's about connecting to the ultimate cause of all of reality. And recognizing that there is such a cause of all of reality is the first step towards connecting to God. And they needed it then. We need it now too. Okay? Okay.
That phrase is actually, you said, I am, I will be.
It can also mean that. I am, I will, I was, I am, I will be. It can be an expression of eternity as well.
Thank you, Reverend.
Thank you.